Hey guys, what's up? This is AU Lowry, and I'm here to bring you a Black Mage, a beginner Black Mage guide to kind of explain how the Black Mage works in Final Fantasy XIV Realm Reborn, and how they change from when you're starting to level up until when they're level 50, their roles in dungeons, and how they perform compared to other classes. Now, basically, for those who are new to either Final Fantasy games or MMOs in general, the basic outline of a Black Mage in this game, they are a magic-based range damage dealing class. So they primarily use magic to deal their damage at a preferably far range. One of the benefits of that is that, one, you're ranged, so you'll be able to, especially during leveling, you'll be able to deal your damage before things start to kill you or before they start to do a large amount of damage to you. For Black Mages in this game, one of the reasons to play one is that they have the highest, or at least one of the highest. They're the highest burst damaged jobs in the game. Their damage is very, very, very high for what compared to what other classes can do. And although it takes a little while to like get to that point where you start doing like really high damage, once you're there, it's very, very hard to compare with a lot of other classes. They're also very efficient at damage dealing. You won't get caught, like if you play it properly, you won't get too caught up in having to like pause for a moment to like do any sort of unnecessary stuff compared to like I think it's sometimes the Lancer has to be in a certain position to maximize their damage. Same with Monk. You don't have to worry about that with Black Mage. It doesn't matter where you are in terms of position. Your damage is not affected by if you're on the flank or behind them. They have a ton of utility skills as well. They can utilize things like sleep, which obviously puts a target to sleep. As you get further on, this becomes an AoE, so it's one of the best crowd control skills in the game. They have a skill called Apocatastasis. I have a hard time pronouncing that all the time, but it's a very good defensive buff for a tank or somebody who's low in HP when the elemental AoE comes around. It's very, very, very strong for basically an instant cast and could potentially save your healer or your tank depending on the situation. Mana Ward and Mana Wall, which are very good self-defensive cooldowns, which the Mana Ward lowers magic damage that you're taking up to 30%, which is really strong, and Mana Wall nullifies 2 physical attacks straight up, which is super powerful for things like the level 50 Dungeon Wanderer's Palace. Like if you get caught with a big Tonberry, you can just nullify 2 attacks while the rest of your party gets through. You have Lethargy, which is basically a slow and a heavy. This is very effective on the bosses that are affected by it. It's very effective on fast-moving mobs that might get to your healer or whatnot. You know, little things like that. Freeze, which is kind of a slow cast time, but it creates a blind effect, which lowers their accuracy by, I believe it's 20%. I'm not too sure on that. And Swift Cast and Sure Cast, which Swift Cast makes your next spell basically cast immediately. I'll show you here. For example, with Swift Cast, if I wanted to use fire, it would take me about 2-ish seconds, a little bit longer than that. But if I use Swift Cast with fire, it'll cast immediately, like so. And Sure Cast, which basically lets me cast my next spell without being interrupted at all. The only note with Sure Cast is that it's not affected by paralysis, the status effect, because it doesn't count as an interruption for that specific status effect. I'm not sure if other status effects cause interruption, but for paralysis alone, it's like Surecast does not mitigate the effect of paralysis. And cross-class skills which are Virus and Physic. Virus is a very, very good debuff to use on big bosses. Lowers their strength and dex by 15%. This is good on very large bosses that do really, really heavy physical damage. It has kind of a long cooldown, but it's still something that you want to add into your rotation when you're available to do, or when you're able to do it. And Physic is a very nice heal to have when you're like soloing and things like that. the beginning, the learning curve of a black mage, like learning how to play a black mage, is pretty easy. Like it's not too hard to get into, because the first few skills that they give you are very straightforward. They give you your fire, they give you your blizzard, and they give you transpose, which lets you switch between your astral fire and umbral ice, which I'll get into in a little bit. But yeah, it's very easy to get into. Now, about transpose, you have these two buffs. One is called astral fire, which I'll turn on right now. Astral fire basically lets you do more damage with your spells, but it takes up much more MP. When you're going through your rotation, you're primarily using fire. When you switch to astral ice, oh, I'm sorry, not astral ice, umbral ice. My apologies. Umbral ice lets you deal less damage, but your MP regeneration goes way up. So I'm gonna use Flare to like use all of my MP really quickly to show you just how quickly the MP regen is. So Flare takes all of your MP, so this is a good example to show you. Umbral Ice just quickly restores your MP. For one stack of Umbral Ice, you restore about 1k every 2 seconds-ish. This is very useful in your rotation, especially when you're leveling, because you want to be able to switch between fire and ice. You want to use your ice spells when you need to regen MP. So your rotation when you're leveling is basically you want to cast fire until you're not able to cast it anymore. And eventually you'll get to a point where you want to transpose right into ice. Usually, like, a lot of people want to just switch to blizzard, but the problem with just switching to blizzard is that you go through a certain point where you won't be able to get that buff from umbral ice. You'll wind up having neither buff, and then you'll go to ice on your second cast. So transpose just skips all of that and lets you recover your MP and go right into your ice rotation. As you level and go on, like when you hit 50, you'll be able to start using like Fire 3 and Blizzard 3. And transpose becomes less of a major factor, but we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, like as you're leveling and whatnot, the learning curve is fairly low. It's not too bad. They give you very like skills. They give you skills with very obvious uses. Like there's not much intricacy. The problem with Black Mage, and there definitely are cons to playing Black Mage. One of them is that they are very slow for a damage dealing class. It takes a very long time to get that damage going. As said before, they need a build up. They need to be able to get to their 3 stacks of Astral Fire, which is the maximum amount of stacks you can hold. And however you do it, there are multiple ways of getting to those 3 stacks, but it's going to take a little while anyway. Like if you cast your Fire 3, it'll take about a little bit more than 3 seconds. My cast time right now is 3.45 seconds, and that's a long time in like an encounter. They can be, because of the fact that they're kind of slow, or they're very slow rather, they can very easily be interrupted and thrown off by like random AoEs that come down on the ground, or catching aggro from something that may be lurking around, things like that. And that can throw off your momentum pretty, like it's pretty annoying. When you're trying to build up your stacks, or when you're trying to transition over and you're out of MP but you can't because you have to move out of this AoE, oftentimes that happens, and you can lose your stacks of Astral Fire or Umbral Ice, which completely throws off everything, especially if you're out of MP. When you're out of MP and then you lose your stacks, it takes a long time to like build that up again, because you have to get your MP back and then get back into your damage dealing rotation. It takes a lot of micromanagement as well to like be able to keep track of all of this stuff. It's a lot of not straightforward math, but math relative to the situation that's going on, and you need to be able to adjust on the fly just in case something goes wrong. There will be fights that are just ridiculously easy, you don't have to worry about it, and you just continue with your fire rotation into your ice and back to your fire. But when you're in like really chaotic fights, like I know that some of the level 50 raiding boss fights can get super chaotic, and you have to like move all the time. You have to consider all of that along with your utility skills that you use, like being able to not mess up your rotation while still getting your math right and things like that. So that can it's very difficult to be able to micromanage that and be aware of what's going on. It's very easy to mess up. As said before, the learning curve is it's very easy at the beginning, but it gets much steeper once you hit 50 and start doing raids. And it also doesn't help that their HP pool is among the lowest in the game. I believe it is the lowest in the game. I'm pretty sure White Mage is slightly higher, but Black Mages have the lowest HP in the game, so you can't really afford to mess up. Like, it's very high risk, high reward to play. It's pretty much the definition of a glass cannon, but much more complicated than you might expect in a lot of other MMOs, if that makes sense. And also, the level 50 skills that you get, which are Flare and Ethereal Manipulation, they're not very, like, you won't use them that often compared to a lot of other Jobs' skills. Like Ethereal Manipulation I use very rarely, and Flare is only very useful in a very specific situation, which I'll get into later. But yeah, your early level rotation as a Black Mage, when you're leveling and whatnot, you want to use Fire until you're very low on MP, or until you can't cast the Fire anymore. And eventually you just want to transpose into your Blizzard. This is very basic. You're going to be using this throughout most of your leveling up until you get a skill, which I'll get into in a second. But you just want to keep that going, using Blizzard until you get enough MP. Now you can either, when you're at this point, when you have your Umbral Ice and your transpose is still on cooldown, you can either keep casting Blizzard and then transpose back to Fire and continue your rotation, or you can just use Fire and skip the transpose. I'm not entirely sure which one is better, because I flip-flopped between both as I was leveling, but I'll leave that up to you and your preference, really, because I don't think it's a huge deal, regardless of which one you use. As you go on, as you start hitting level 50 and getting all of your skills, you'll begin to use Blizzard one less, and this is mostly because of a passive skill called Firestarter. What Firestarter does is it grants a 40% chance that upon casting Fire, your next Fire 3 will require no MP and have no cast time. What this means is, whenever I cast a Fire 1, I have a 40% chance of my Fire 3 being instant cast and have no mana cost, which lets me do that. So, if for those who have played World of Warcraft, who have played mages or have experienced mages in that game, the skill I believe is called Hot Streak. That whole rotation thing for fire mages in World of Warcraft, it's very similar. So you'll be able to use Fire until you get to your Fire 3 or until it procs, whichever. One thing's going to happen first. Your Fire 3 is going to proc, or you'll have to switch to your ice, to your Umbral Ice. The reason why transpose becomes less useful when you are level 50 is because when you have 3 stacks of either Astral Fire or Umbral Ice, the opposite element that you cast will be half the cast time. So if I have a Fire 3 setup and I want to switch to Umbral Ice, I'll just cast Blizzard 3 and it's much faster. Instead of 3.45 seconds, it's half that. The opposite also applies. If I have 3 stacks of Umbral Ice, I'll use Fire, and that's half the cast time, and I can go right back into rotation. So your level 50 rotation, the very basic rotation, you want to use Fire 1 to proc your Firestarter, which just did proc, so I'll use that. Continue as normal with your Fire 1. And I got another proc there, which is good. And then when I feel like I'm low on mana, I'll just switch to Blizzard 3 and adjust from there. Now, you can do a lot of things here. You can use Blizzard 3, and you can go right back into Fire 3, assuming you don't have a proc. If you don't have a Firestarter proc, you'll get 1 tick of mana regen, because the 3 stacks of Umbral Ice is it's a lot of mana that you regen. I believe it's around 2/3. So you can switch right back to Fire and continue your rotation, which is super useful because you're not in the Umbral Ice that long. You're able to maximize the amount of damage that you deal because Fire is your strongest element, and it's more on the efficient side. Like, this is what makes Black Mage very, very efficient. The other skill that's very important to have for Black Mage is Raging Strikes, which is a cross-class skill from Archer that you get at level 4. This increases your damage dealt by 20%. Period. This is the best cross-class skill you can get. I don't think there's a reason why you shouldn't get it, because there's no downside to it other than a cross-class slot, and Black Mages they don't have too many great cross-class skills, so you should have plenty of room to have this. The other skill I want to talk about is Thunder. Thunder is your dot, or your damage over time skill, and what makes this skill so good is that there's a 5% chance after each tick that the potency of the next Thunder, Thunder 2, or Thunder 3 will be 340, have no cast time, and cost no MP. To put that in perspective, Fire 3 has a potency of 220. So when this procs, like if you, like it may not happen here because again it's a 5% chance, but when this procs, it's a huge burst in damage. It's a huge damage dealing skill that you can throw into your rotation whenever it procs. It's very nice to have. You can swift cast off of it to like get it quickly because the cast time is kind of slow, but again, it's very nice to throw this on. It can be kind of easy to forget, but especially for bosses, you definitely want to do this for bosses, especially off of a swift cast. And when you proc, it's just a huge damage boost, and it also resets the dot. So it's definitely something to keep in mind when you can remember it. I know I forget all the time, but I've gotten, you know, it's good to get into the habit of being able to include that into your rotation. And that's about it for the basic stuff. Like those are very basic things for a Black Mage rotation. You know, how to get going in terms of fighting, in terms of getting into an encounter and whatnot. The other utility skills, Convert and Swift Cast, these are essential for setting up a flare. Flare by itself is not a very good skill because the cast time is super long. It's pretty much 4 seconds, and it costs all of your MP. So you probably ask yourself, why would you ever use this thing in like a practical encounter? The answer is that you wouldn't, because most of the time it's just not as effective as using one of your 2 AoE skills, which is Fire 2 or Blizzard 2. Especially when you have 3 stacks of Astral Fire or Umbra Ice. Ideally what you want to do is, when you're in an AoE situation, you want to swift cast your flare and then convert some of your MP back so you can jump right back into your rotation. So for example, if I'm using fire and I get caught in an AoE situation, you might want to like start using some Fire 2s, and then you can start setting up your flare, because flare requires, I believe, at least 5% of your MP to use. So if I were to use this and I don't have enough MP, then I won't be able to use flare. This is important because you really want to gauge how many casts you can get away with before you're actually trying to set up that flare. Also, actually, since we're in this situation, if you run out of MP like that, it's a very good idea to like transpose if you can't cast anything, because oftentimes you actually won't have enough mana to cast Blizzard or like any of your spells. So transpose takes on a backup role compared to the primary role that it has when you're leveling, in that if you mess up your rotation, or if you wind up using too much mana that you can't cast anything, you can just transpose, wait a little bit, get that little mana you need to start casting something, and try to get right back into your rotation. Convert is the second cooldown that you use when you're using flare. So if I were to get my 3 stacks here, you want to swift cast, flare, and then convert some mana back. It's a very strong way of dealing with extra adds that might be on a boss and whatnot. Like it's super powerful, and it also gives you 3 stacks of Astral Fire, which means you can just go right back into your Blizzard rotation once you use the mana that convert gave you. It's a very good thing to keep in mind because oftentimes you'll have like these really strong ads and you need to burst them down quickly, and Black Mage is very good at taking care of ads in a burst damage sort of manner. Other things about Black Mage to keep in mind, again, you'll have situations where you need to protect yourself, and using Mana Ward and Mana Wall. Both of these skills is cooldowns. It's not too long, like 2 minutes, but it's very useful for just like trying to stay alive because your HP is not very good. So having all of these defensive skills and even lethargy is just very helpful. And that about does it for the beginner stuff. I know it's a lot to take in and there's a lot to learn, but the rewarding thing about Black Mage is that you can always just get better. It's more than just the gear that you're wearing. It's how efficient you are. It's your movement, your awareness, and all of that stuff. Like, I'm always feeling like when I get better at actually playing Black Mage, that my damage is a direct representation of myself improving, which is awesome. But that about wraps it up for this one. I'll definitely be doing a video of like actual application of all of these things, and we'll be most likely be doing this on stream and on YouTube for different encounters and how to adjust on certain things, because that's it's a very important skill to learn. But that about wraps it up. Be sure to check me out on Twitch, twitch.tv/AU Lowry. I'll put it in the info. Check me out on YouTube and XIVnation.com. And thank you guys for watching.